Hello there and welcome back to Valdis Story, Abyssal City. Today we're going to continue deeper into the city of Tagram and meet with the Elder and find out what he wants. While talking to NPCs along the way, of course, like this merchant here, who will be useful in the future. Not right now though. More immediately useful is this little tip from this NPC. These mana heaters are necessary for humans to survive in this sunken city, and that areas without them are inhabitable. You should keep that in mind. But here we are at the Elder's home for a somewhat long dialogue sequence. These happen on occasion in this game, although they're fairly infrequent, which is good. The purpose of this one is pretty much just to set up some background detail and introduce some of the elements of the game's plot. Like the fact that the surface has been largely scoured by the forces under the guard's control. Not actually all that important of a detail because pretty much all of that stuff, anything outside of the city itself, is kind of just setting up for a sequel that may or may not ever happen. The developers of this game are actually working on another game right now, but it is entirely unrelated. Both plot-wise and gameplay-wise, it's a tactics style game. Looks interesting though. Anyway, the task that the Elder is giving us here is to deliver a communique to the next town over, who they have lost communications with thanks to an angelic presence in the east. As I mentioned, it's not just the demons that are bad in this game. There's also the detail that every human who stays down here has their hair turn white for no apparent reason. I don't know why they bothered to make this a detail because it never really comes up again and they don't really ever properly explain it either. As I said, the plot in this game isn't really what you're playing it for. More importantly, we just picked up a wall hook which allows us to do the wall jump that is so common in Metroidvania style games. That gives us a lot more movement options and actually allows us to recover some items in the previous area that we explored. Which is where we're actually going right now. Not for that reason though. We'll be returning later when we have a few more movement upgrades to pick up that sort of stuff. But we do want to backtrack a little bit because we have a date with a rather feral personage. That giant Yeti beast that we saw last time that chased us and the demons away. We're gonna want to go meet with it right now. We don't have to do this is a completely optional goal, but let me just say that you'll probably regret not taking it down now. Not to mention that beating it gives you quite a huge chunk of XP for this early on in the game. Enough to actually give you 1 or even 2 levels, no matter what your current level of experience is at, and that helps in the upcoming area. Now we're gonna have to backtrack through a few rooms that we went through before, which ends up being a little bit more annoying. These enemy designs are very clearly designed to go from top down, rather than bottom up. Not that you have to explicitly kill the enemies along your way, goodbye to that demon. Although it is best if you do manage to kill them, not just for the XP, but for any drops that they may drop. Enemies can drop a whole host of items, and you'll want as many of every type of item as you can possibly manage. You're gonna need them if you want to get the good stuff. But finally we make it back to this feral beast, who Reina shall not yield to. So while you do want to take this boss on immediately for reasons that will become apparent later, it's kind of an annoying boss to take down at this point, not because it's especially difficult. Its attack patterns are incredibly simplistic and very easy to learn even if you're fighting him for your first time. Rather, what makes him so difficult is the fact that he has so much goddamn HP that even if you're attacking him optimally, it's gonna take several minutes to take him down. You're also likely to run into issues with managing your skill cancels at this point because you have only one. Now, you've probably noticed by now that it takes time for your skill cancel to regenerate. And what's even worse, and what is probably my least favorite thing about the combat system, is that while you're attacking, your skill cancels will not regenerate 1 iota, and you have to wait a good 1 to 2 seconds after stopping attacking for the regeneration to restart. So if you don't carefully manage how often you attack, you won't recover any skill cancels, and when you only have one, that can lead to a lot of tricky situations. Skill canceling behind this dude is a key part of fighting him, especially if you're playing as any character other than Reina. Reina can make up for that either by using the dash to move behind him in place of the skill cancel, or for using her other side magic skill, the Golden Aegis, which will block his ice slamming attack. So yeah, this guy's kind of a pain in the ass to fight at this point. But as long as you avoid getting hit for the most part, you're probably guaranteed to get an S rank. The time ranking in this is actually pretty lenient. You probably won't get an S, but you're nearly guaranteed to get an A. So yeah, before we finish this beastie off, let's discuss his attack patterns. As I mentioned before, they are quite simple. If you're close to him, he'll alternate between an attempt to grab you and the ice slamming attack that goes somewhat far away from his body. After 2 repetitions of this pattern, he'll shoot ice projectiles up into the air, and you can only stop him by getting behind him in some way and attacking his back. Which, it should be noted, any attacks toward his back automatically crit, so do your strongest moves toward his back. Otherwise, his only other attack is a long-range punch. Yes, I know that's rather oxymoronic, but bear with me, that he only does when you're far away. It can actually be worthwhile to bait this out in order to reposition him, say, closer to the platforms, which makes things easier for you. But yeah, as long as you're armed with this knowledge and you're careful, you shouldn't have too much trouble taking this dude down, and he is very worth taking down at this point. As I said, enough experience for 2 levels at this point, which importantly brings us to level 5, unlocking the next tier of skills, letting us unlock a skill that allows Reina's kicks to actually god break now. This is the single most useful thing you can do for Reina if you're using her unarmed moveset. And at this point, we really don't have a choice, that's the only weapon that she has. But yeah, 2 levels, and you also get an additional skill point for getting an S rank, which is quite useful. And to top it all off, we have the unique boss reward of that Snow White mane, which we'll see the use of in a while. Yeah, expect me to use that phrase, which we'll see in a while, quite often. So, side task complete, let's get back to the main task at hand and accomplish that request from Elder. It's not like we have anything better to do, and maybe we'll encounter some more crew along the way. Oh, one thing that's important to note here, keep this in the back of your mind. Note this item here, the Warm Elixir, that increases ice magic resistance and prevents cold damage in frozen areas. That'll become relevant quite soon. But yeah, let's get back to doing Elder's request. Shouldn't be too tough, we had no trouble taking down demons, surely a few angels won't pose too much of a threat. So here we come to the first spot in the game where you're going to use your wall jump if you don't backtrack. It works about how you'd expect. Jump into a wall and then away, and you'll be able to jump off of it. Now this leads up here to a jump that normally at this point we would not be able to make, but by getting a little bit of an extra air boost by casting a magic spell in the middle of the air, we are. Now, making it up to the Mesmer right now isn't very useful because he's responsible for respecking, which we're not really going to do right now. We just started the game, it's not useful. But it is worth keeping that air boost technique in mind because it can be used to reach quite a few treasure chests earlier than you're meant to, and pick up some potentially quite useful items depending on how you're building your character. So here we see our first angel, which is the typical holier-than-thou type. Yeah, the angels aren't really too much more threatening than the demons. In fact, arguably they're less so. None of the enemy types in this area have the annoyingly quick attacks that the demon dudes have, nor the potentially tricky to get rid of shields that the demon ladies have. The only potential tricky thing to deal with regards to them is that they really like to block, but as long as you have the ability to god break on command, as we now do, it's really not an issue. That's why I emphasize taking down the Yeti now, not just because of what that will affect later, but seriously, getting those 2 extra levels helps tons. And that's good because the combat in this area has a bit of an issue, and this is one of my other overarching issues with the game. It has a lot of combat, it has a lot of platforming, and even a little bit of puzzle solving, you could say. We'll get into that. The issue is that it doesn't really synthesize these well together. They work fine separately in a vacuum from each other, but when they're interplayed, it is not designed very well at all. In this area, for example, there's a lot of platforming and a lot of pits that you can fall into, thankfully none of the insta-kill-you kind. But if you're in the midst of fighting an enemy, these pits end up being a huge nuisance, especially when fighting the flying angels. Because how it'll usually go is you'll jump up into the air, do a few attacks towards the angel, and then inevitably start dropping back towards the ground. And because your aerial maneuverability at this stage of the game is fairly limited, there's a good chance you'll fall down one of those pits, and end up having to repeat a bunch of the platforming that you just did. And you'll have to do that possibly multiple times if you're really dedicated at killing all of the enemies in a room. That's why, even though killing every enemy that you can is definitely the optimal way to do things for the drops in the XP that you'll be getting, I would honestly recommend skipping them if they end up giving you some trouble. It'll end up saving you time in the long run, and most likely you'll have all the items and experience you'll need by the end of the game. It's extremely unlikely you'll ever need to grind for levels, and it's fairly unlikely that you'll ever need to grind too much for drops. So I mentioned before that the angels for the most part are less threatening for the demons. That changes here with this enemy type, which depending on your setup can be a right pain in the ass to kill. I don't have trouble here thankfully, but what makes them really difficult is that any attacks from the front they block completely, and will even respond with their own counterattacks. Add that to the fact that they have a pretty speedy regeneration, and if you don't have a build that's good at getting around their shield, such as by skill cancelling or dashing behind them, you simply won't be able to output enough damage to outpace their regeneration, and you just straight up can't kill them. This is even more of an issue if there are other enemies in the area to distract you from focus firing on them. Again, it wasn't an issue here, but if you're having trouble with them, just dash past. Better than giving yourself a headache. So what I just kind of completely failed to discuss there, that is the first of the game's platforming challenge / puzzle-ish segments that I mentioned earlier. It has them every now and again, 1, maybe 2 per area, where you have to hit a series of switches in order to get past a series of doors in a limited amount of time. If you succeed at doing so, you'll be rewarded with a useful piece of treasure at the end, usually, if not always, a new armor set. And armor sets in this game are one of the greatest ways that you differentiate how you're building your character, as the bonuses that they give can be quite significant. That Paladin's armor there is a very useful general purpose one early on. It not only gives you a bit of extra damage from a light magic burst every 6th hit, but it also prevents you from being silenced, frozen, or paralyzed, all of which are incredibly annoying status effects, so being able to just ignore them entirely is really nice. Now, we elected against equipping it because at the moment it wouldn't be too useful. Mainly because that +1/2 basic combo bonus from our default armor is kind of necessary for Reina's damage output. We have a -1 bonus from the accessory we have equipped, the weighted gauntlets, and we really need to offset that. As I said before, Reina is all about getting in a whole bunch of hits at once, and reducing her basic combo makes that a lot trickier. So the one other thing that I glossed over was that rather distinct save room that we came across earlier. Not 1, but 2 save statues, one broken, and a grave in between with a RIP Peish marked upon it. That actually wasn't always there. It used to be a regular save room, but that was added in one of the patches. I believe that Peish was a friend of the developers who died, and so they honored him by having that in their game. That's not the first time I've seen something like that in a video game, and it's always sweet when it happens. That right there was one of those elite leader, whatever the hell you want to call them, enemy types that locks you in and forces you to fight them. This one actually starts a precedent that continues for most of the game, where they're typically placed right before a boss fight. and that's actually a nice little bit of design. These elite enemies are more likely to drop rarer items such as high tier souls, which end up giving you a bit of an HP and MP restoration, useful if you're low on those right before fighting a boss. Speaking of bosses, let's actually get to talking about this one right here, Tegu. This is the first of a few bosses we'll be fighting throughout the game that actually has 2 health bars. The first is its armor, which is very physically resistant but quite weak to magic. So if you're playing as Reina, you'll be wanting to re-up your God Hand quite a bit to maximize your damage output. Once you've broken her shield, her core will be revealed, and you'll be able to deal damage to her health. This process is something you'll repeat until you end up killing her. For most characters, it will end up taking 2 to 3 cycles. It varies depending on your character's build and the difficulty you're playing on. On God Hand, with Reina especially, it's really difficult to do her in 2 cycles. But on the easier difficulties and with Wyatt, who has very strong dark magic, especially effective against an angelic enemy like this, you can end up pretty easily doing it in 1 cycle, if you're focused. And you absolutely do want to do it as optimally as possible, because the longer the fight goes on and the lower HP that Tegu has, the more difficult things become, almost exponentially. She starts summoning more and more projectiles and spawning in more and more angelic minions, which make things really difficult to deal with. That's why I decided to end things right there, rather than prolonging them and trying to go for the ass rank. Sorry for that one person who hoped I would be able to continue that streak throughout the game. I guaranteed you that if I had attempted to showboat in that way, I probably would have failed to get an S rank entirely. Oh yeah, one last little detail about Tegu before we move on. If you read her lore entry, yeah, there's a lore guide in the game that fills in as you go throughout and fight more bosses and whatnot. If you read her entry, you'll realize that she's an angel who is piloting basically a magic mech, which is pretty cool. Beating her allows us to unlock this mana keystone, which will be a key feature going forward. This allows us to activate those mana crystals that we've seen a few times before, which are used to open up gates. So entering this new area, the first thing that you're likely to notice is that you're constantly taking damage. Damage that I'll note is proportional to your max HP, so it's always going to be a significant drain on your health. You may also notice if you pay attention to the background that there was a mana heater up there that was broken. Remember before how I mentioned it would be significant that humans cannot survive in areas without mana heaters? That they're necessary for the areas to be livable? Yeah, in areas without mana heaters, they just end up freezing over. It's an abyssal city after all, it's quite deep in the ocean. And that means you will constantly be taking damage from the freezing temperatures. Now, you may also recall that I remarked on the warmth elixir that Ziggy was selling, that not only gives ice damage resistance, but prevents us from taking damage from cold environments. Yeah, that's why you want to try and buy one of those before continuing on from Tagrum. Doing this area with one of those without constantly taking damage from the environment itself makes things a lot more manageable. To the point that, even if you end up having to grind materials to acquire a warmth elixir, I strongly recommend doing so. It just makes this area so much easier, it's worth whatever time investment that requires. The only reason I didn't do that here is because I wanted to show off this feature. So what we just did in that room was another one of those racing platforming challenges I mentioned, and that gave us a new piece of armor that we are going to equip. The Wanderer raiment is one of the best armors you can use when you're running an agility build. It not only gives you a significant agility bonus, which gives you a higher crit chance, but it also gives you extra crit damage as part of one of its innate bonuses. Very, very useful. If you're not running an agility build, this is probably the point that you're going to want to slap on the Paladin armor if you have not already done so. It doesn't protect you from the environmental frozen damage, but it does prevent you from being frozen by enemies, which makes things a little bit easier. Oh yeah, going back to the environmental damage, one other thing I want to mention. Those warmth elixirs and the other types of elixirs that we'll be seeing throughout the game, because of course it's not just freezing that you have to deal with, oh no. They weren't originally in the game, they were added later with an update. previously you had no choice, you just had to deal with that environmental damage. Yep. This does show that the developers were willing to listen about the design of the game. In fact, that's actually probably a topic I'm going to be bringing up again and again. The game as it is now is quite a bit different than it was when it initially launched. They have made a ton of changes and additions to the content within the game. Not all of them good, admittedly, but it's really nice to see when developers actually respond to feedback and try to make the game better and more accommodating to the player. So, all of that stuff aside, we're coming to the last boss of today's episode, which is why we're healing up a bunch here. Oh yeah, I never actually discussed those spirit potions explicitly. We picked up this one a while back in the Mausoleum. They are for mana what the health potions are to health, but unlike the health potions, they do not affect your ranking during boss fights, so feel free to use them. And bringing up boss ranking, one of the things I want to discuss with this boss is that she is perhaps the most difficult boss to S-rank in the entire game. She's not a difficult boss, she's difficult to S-rank, and I want to articulate that point. The reason that she's so difficult to S-rank specifically is the fact that the requirements for getting an S-rank in each of the categories, aside from the potion one, are incredibly stringent. We're only halfway done and we pretty much already run out of time to get the S-rank for the time score. And though I don't show it here, getting an S-rank for the combat score is equally difficult because if you get hit even a single time, you're not going to get an S-rank for the combat. The only way to recover your combat score from being hit is to attack the boss enough times, and Rockjaw here is squishy enough that you're going to kill her before you recover it enough. And the way that this boss fight is set up almost guarantees that you're going to be hit at least once unless you're incredibly careful. I didn't really discuss the boss itself, mainly because it's more of an ongoing platforming challenge than anything. Rockjaw is composed of 3 portions, lower, upper, and middle, with the middle portion being the one that has the health bar. You need to travel around the room and attack the currently active portion, the only one that is unshielded, until you've damaged it enough to move on to the next portion, rinse and repeat until Rockjaw is dead. Notably, this can be made a lot easier by making use of the ice pillars that the middle portion will spawn regularly. Ice pillars that, as you can see, we now have access to for having acquired Rockjaw's soul. This will be one of a few souls that we pick up from killing a few certain bosses throughout the game. And the cool thing is that each soul gives a full suite of spells, one of which is usually used for environmental puzzle solving, breaking through a wall, creating an extra platform to allow you to get to new areas, that sort of thing. The other 3 spells are typically purely for combat usage, and we'll be checking them out in the near future. But not today, as you can no doubt notice, we're coming to the end of this update as we have finally reached the city of Rock. I'm never good at rolling my R's, and I think you're supposed to do that to pronounce this city's name properly. But my bungled pronunciations aside, this here is the elder of this village, Elder Brazier. God damn it, game. Give me words I know how to pronounce. She immediately gives us another menial task to do, which Reina just kind of meekly accepts. Reina is too kind for her own good. But that is a task that we'll be getting to next time, along with actually exploring this village and talking to all of the NPCs. 'Cause I think that's enough for now. Next time, you get to look forward to an area that is possibly even more aggravating than the frozen one we just did. Yay.